Welcome to this e-learning course on FIRE, a framework for integrating rights and equality into disaster risk reduction and climate resilience. This is the module on fundamental rights and equality. There are three learning outcomes for this module on fundamental rights and equality. Having completed the module, participants will be able to 1. Identify those fundamental rights that are most relevant to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. 2. Recognize important characteristics of these fundamental rights. And 3. Explain how these rights should be respected, protected, and fulfilled in the context of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. A human rights-based approach to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation focuses on the fundamental rights that are contained in international treaties, regional human rights instruments, as well as national constitutions. These treaties provide a catalogue of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. Although all rights are interdependent and interconnected, key rights that are directly relevant in this context include the right to life, the right to food, the right to water, the right to shelter, the right to education, and the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Now, it's important to note that disaster risk reduction is a whole of society, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder initiative. And this means that many other rights that are reflected in international standards and guidelines should also be addressed in this context. Equality is recognized as a fundamental right, for instance under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the CEDAW Convention. This makes measures to ensure gender equality in DRR a legal duty, and one which is a key element of every other dimension of FIRE. Core components of economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to health and the right to shelter, include availability, accessibility, cultural acceptability, and quality. And these aspects of fundamental rights help us to appreciate how they may be relevant in particular contexts as we develop further below. Although not generally reflected in guidance documents concerning specific rights, there's good reason to consider adding a fifth component to this list: sustainability. Indeed, the connection between fundamental rights and the Sustainable Development Goals is clear, with many SDGs and associated targets reflecting fundamental rights established by international human rights treaties. Focusing on fundamental rights also draws attention to both what authorities must do, as well as what they must avoid doing. Three forms of conduct are in focus. These are respect, protect, and fulfill. Respecting rights in the context of disaster risk reduction might include avoiding land use planning decisions that deprive people of their enjoyment of rights to property and to shelter, to work, to the enjoyment of cultural life, and so forth. No-build zones, for instance, might be introduced to protect people from disaster-related harm, but can have serious economic, social, and cultural impacts. Authorities are also responsible for protecting people from private sector actors. In situations of food insecurity, such as in the aftermath of a flood or during a drought, limited availability of food can cause prices to rise dramatically, with serious consequences for the accessibility of food. Authorities must take steps to protect the right to food in the context of disasters, for instance by enforcing price controls. Finally, the duty to fulfill rights means that authorities need to guarantee at least a minimum core of economic and social rights. In an emergency context, this duty involves ensuring availability, accessibility, cultural acceptability and quality of food, shelter, water and sanitation, health care, and other fundamental rights. Stockpiling such supplies in accessible locations and with mechanisms to ensure equitable distribution is a complementary way for authorities to discharge this duty. Civil society and private sector actors can also integrate consideration of fundamental rights and equality into their work relating to disaster risk reduction, paying attention to how the catalogue of rights might be affected by any activities they're involved in. The SPHERE standards provide detailed guidance on the minimum standards authorities and other actors should strive to attain in a humanitarian emergency. Other detailed standards and guidelines that expressly endorse a human rights-based approach include the Interagency Standing Committee Operational Guidelines on the Protection of Persons in Situations of Natural Disasters and the Mass Evacuation in Natural Disasters Guide, or the MEND Guide, along with many others. Although fundamental rights and equality are directly relevant in the context of risk assessment and land use planning as well, international standards and guidelines are less well developed. By using the catalogue of rights and the core principles summarized above, actors can address the fundamental rights and equality issues in all aspects of disaster risk reduction.